நிஜமான கதைகள் சுவையோடு சுகமாக உருவான கதைகள்.
குட்டி ஸ்டோரியோட ஒலி புத்தக பகுதியில் இன்னைக்கு நான் வாசிக்க போகிற நூல் ஹிஸ்ட்ரி ஃபார் கிட்ஸ் சிவில் ரைட்ஸ் மூமெண்ட். இந்த புத்தகம் டினோ பிபின்ற பப்ளிஷிங் ஹவுஸோடது. அமெரிக்கன் சிவில் ரைட்ஸ் மூமெண்ட் 1950s 60s. Chap-1, A Brief History of Civil Rights. Right through the history of the United States of America, you will see the determined and consistent efforts of improving the civil rights in the country. The common people and leaders continuously worked to ensure every citizen had equal civil rights regardless of race, gender, caste, creed, or any other discriminating factor. The colonists who declared independence from their British rulers set up a founding document or constitution which gave a clear roadmap on how they would govern and rule their new federation. This founding document of the country emphasized the importance of a guaranteed equal rights for all citizens of the USA. United States Constitution. Yet, even in this document, certain classes of people, especially new entrants into the country, like the slaves from Africa, did not have essential civil rights. Even basic inalienable civil rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were not available to them. They were unable to receive the status of being people of the United States, and people promoted slavery during that time by setting up punishments and compulsory return of escaped slaves. Antique early American engraving depicting social issues circa 1850s. The southern states enforced these rules more strictly than the northern states because agriculture greatly impacted the economy of the southern states. The states flourished primarily because of tobacco, cotton, and sugar crops. Underpaid and malnourished slaves ran, managed, and worked the plantations in the south. Social life post-Civil War. The most significant outcome of the Civil War in the United States was the Emancipation Proclamation, which became the law as the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. This amendment, which came into effect in 1865, outlawed slavery of any kind. The 14th and 15th Amendments followed soon after, which set the foundation for achieving political equality of African Americans. Emancipation Proclamation. When the US abolished the slavery at the end of the Civil War, the economy of the southern states began to decline. Thanks to the non-availability or reducing availability of cheap labor, the initial post-Civil War years were confusing for many of the newly freed slaves. Nearly all of them had little or no education, and the only thing they knew was farming and agricultural labor. Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation went into the effect, only 50,000 of the 4 million slaves in the United States were freed. However, over time, millions of slaves were set free thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation. The emancipation also allowed African Americans to join the Union Northern Army. About 200,000 blacks joined, helping the northern states win the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation was not yet a fully approved law. It was only an executive order that paved the way for the 13th Amendment. The advantage of using the emancipation approach is that things were likely to happen faster than waiting for the law to pass. Moreover, France and Great Britain, who had already abolished slavery, supported the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment, which was the actual law based on the Emancipation Proclamation was passed and adopted into the US Constitution on December 6, 1865. An easy to understand version of the 13th Amendment runs as follows: slavery and other forms of compulsive involuntary service are illegal in the United States. Also, many of the slaves believed freedom meant freedom from work, while others were scared to work for white men because they thought they would become slaves again. Rumors the government would rehabilitate the slaves by giving each of them 40 acres of land and a mule kept the hopes of the ex slaves alive for some time. While this plan never existed, the government did offer some help to freed slaves in the form of free education, food, and shelter until they found alternate living arrangements. A government approved organization called the Freedmen's Bureau, which did some great work, including teaching over 200,000 ex slaves to read and write, helping 10,000 black families settle down on lands confiscated by the government, operated the scheme. Racial segregation before the civil rights movement of 1950s and 1960s. The civil rights movement did not emerge magically overnight. The struggle for equal civil rights had been in place since the early days of the United States of America. Despite the best efforts of the federal government to abolish slavery, racial segregation continued, especially in the southern states, led by the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws segregated blacks and whites in public places. For example, there were separate seats for blacks in public buses and they could not occupy seats reserved for the whites. In the same way, the use of public restrooms, schools, parks, etc. were restricted for the blacks. There were even different drinking water fountains for black people and white people, and blacks could not drink water from the source reserved for the white people. Segregated water fountains. The Jim Crow laws were enforced during the Reconstructions. During the late 1800s until the early 1900s, immediately following the Civil War period, when each of the states took back control of their territories from the federal government. Some of the laws were still in force until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came into effect. Jim Crow laws got its name from an African American character in a song that came out in 1832, after which all people of this race were referred to as Jim Crow. Here are some examples of the Jim Crow laws. In Alabama, all the train stations had separate waiting areas and ticket counters for black people and white people. In Georgia, black people could not be buried on land earmarked as cemeteries for the white people. In Florida, black people and white people had to study in separate schools. In Mississippi, even the prison was segregated. White prisoners had their own eating and sleeping quarters separated from those of African Americans. Another feature of segregation was the grandfather clause, which many states of the United States of America enacted. According to this clause, if any person's ancestor had voting rights before the Civil War, then that person did not need to pass the reading test to vote. All others had to clear the reading test if wanted to vote, and considering that most African Americans had no education, very few of them could read, and most did not have voting rights. NAACP NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. Established in 1909 in New York, this group works for equal civil rights for all minority groups in the country. especially the African Americans. The NAACP fought against racial discrimination in public places, schools, and in workplaces too. The primary goal of the NAACP was to eliminate racial discrimination in the country. Members of the NAACP worked hard to continue to do so to ensure equality of all people in the eyes of the law. The most significant success of the NAACP was a legal case referred to as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. In this case, which happened in 1954, the NAACP lawyers representing an African American fought a legal battle to end segregation in public places. The Supreme Court gave a verdict in favor of the NAACP and ruled that segregation in public places was illegal and the person or persons responsible for it should be punished. Thanks to this ruling of the Supreme Court, children from black families could attend the same school as children from white families. NAACP played a big role in the civil rights movement of the 1950s 1960s. In 1963, the members of the NAACP organized a protest rally called March on Washington, one of the largest civil rights demonstrations held in the United States. Also, the NAACP played a big role in getting two crucial civil rights laws passed: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here are some more interesting and important facts about the NAACP. The founding members of NAACP were from an interracial backgrounds, whites that were sympathetic to the cause and African Americans too. Walter White was the first president of the NAACP, and the other prominent leaders included Mary White Wovington, Henry Moskowitz, Mary Church Terrell, Oswald Garrison Willard, and Ida B. Wells. The NAACP ran a magazine called The Crisis to represent the voice of the suppressed people. The NAACP spearheaded legal matters concerning school segregation in Arkansas, Alabama, and other southern states. The NAACP continues to fight for the underprivileged, deprived, and the disenfranchised even today. KKK. KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist group, wreaked havoc on the African Americans for a long period of time. The members of KKK used fear and violence to achieve their ends. The group formed after the Civil War to frighten and scare the newly freed slaves and to take away the civil rights granted to them by the United States Constitution. In the early days, people called the KKK the Invisible Empire of the South. The leaders of this terrorist group had titles like Grand Titan, Grand Wizard, and Grand Dragon. The members wore white robes with hoods that covered their faces, so it was easy to frighten people yet remain anonymous to the victims. Usually, the members patrolled at night, scaring people with their white ghost like attire and whipping and killing newly freed slaves. They would also burn houses, farms, and barns and left behind a burning cross as the symbol of their group. The KKK's membership ebbed and flowed from the beginning. During the 1920s, their membership was at a peak with over 4 million supporters. As time passed, the enemies of the KKK included not only former slaves but also included Jews, Catholics, and immigrants from other countries. The terrorist group became powerful during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The KKK members protested the civil rights movement by whipping, shooting, and bombing African Americans in the southern states. Thanks to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its strict implementation across the country, the KKK lost its fervor and membership dwindled to a few thousand only. Moreover, today the FBI keeps an eye on the group even as the Supreme Court continues to punish the members with jail terms for hate crimes committed many years before. Therefore, the time before the civil rights movement was rife with confusion as African Americans continued to fight against racial discrimination in the real world, even though theoretically the US Constitution gave them equal rights. இந்த தொகுப்பில் இருக்கிற மீதி அத்தியாயங்களை நம்ம நாளைக்கு பார்க்கலாம்.